This tutorial builds on elements demonstrated previously in the movies, how to enter a client invoice and how to enter a credit memo. Welcome to SapphireOne. Today I'm demonstrating how to enter a client journal. A client journal is generally used to adjust client balances, such as reversing entries after they've been posted, reallocating funds in the general ledger, and balancing out minor sums. If I need to amend a transaction that has not yet been posted, I can simply modify the original data entry. To do this, I go to the Receivables drop-down menu and select Transactions Inquiry. SapphireOne then presents me with a list of all my current transactions. From this list, I select the transaction that requires adjustment and then choose either the Modify button here on the toolbar or use the keyboard shortcut Command-M on a Mac or Control-M on a PC to open and make changes to my transaction. However, after a transaction has been posted, its status will be displayed as yes in the Transaction Inquiry screen. This means that it is no longer editable, and even if I open the transaction using the Modify method, I will not be able to make any changes. So to make an amendment to a posted transaction, I need to create a client journal and then allocate the original transaction to it. The client journal is the fourth data entry item located on the Receivables menu in the Accounts mode of SapphireOne, and when I select it, a new data entry screen appears on my desktop. As with the majority of data entry screens in the Accounts mode of SapphireOne, this window has been divided into four main areas. On the left we have the Transaction and Destination areas, and to the right there's the Management Review and Standing Transaction areas. Let's say I'm creating this client journal because I overcredited an amount to a client's invoice when I issued them a refund, and I have since posted both the invoice and the credit memo. First, I need to link this journal to the client, and I do this by entering their ID into the Client ID field. Remember, if the field is blue, it's searchable, so I can enter just the @ symbol to bring up the entire list of all my clients, or I can enter a part of the client's ID followed by the @ symbol to bring up a reduced list, and from here I simply select the one I need. I now have the option of manually entering all the details for this journal, but to save some time, I'll use the copy transaction method that I demonstrated in how to enter a credit memo and let SapphireOne automatically insert the details for me. To do this, I select the Transaction tab in the Management Review area. When a transaction is linked to a particular client or vendor by their ID, the Transaction tab displays their last 100 or so account transactions. First, I locate the original client credit in the Transaction tab, and for this demonstration, I'll choose the credit with the internal reference number of 2-000. With the transaction highlighted, I either right-click with my mouse on a PC or Control-click on a Mac, and SapphireOne now provides me with two additional methods of entering the data. Because I want to replicate both the line items into the destination area and the transaction details of the original credit memo into the transaction area, I will select the Copy Transaction rather than the Copy Lines method. When I do this, SapphireOne copies all of the destination and transaction details into my journal. Next, I need to adjust the amount of the line item in the destination area to reflect the amount of the overpayment. Let's say the credit memo I issued for the refund was overpaid by $40. I then enter the new balance into the total field in the transaction area to balance my transaction. I will also add a note in the memo field for future reference, and I'll use the clock button to timestamp and date my entry. My out of balance amount is 0, so my green tick is active, and when I select it, SapphireOne accepts and closes the data entry screen. That completes the data entry component for our journal. The next step is to offset the original credit against the client journal I just created. However, the original credit has already been allocated so as to offset the original invoice. I now need to unallocate the credit so I can apply part of it to my client journal, and the remainder I will then allocate back to the invoice. To do this, go to the Receivables drop-down menu and select Allocation Inquiry. By default, SapphireOne only displays transactions that are waiting to be allocated, and as the original credit memo I issued for the refund has already been allocated to the client's invoice, it won't be displayed in this list. To include my previously allocated transactions, I need to open the SapphireOne Find screen. To do this, I can either select the Find button here on the toolbar or use the keyboard shortcut Command F on a Mac or Control F on a PC. From the Find Client Allocation drop-down menu, change the current selection from Standard to All Records, and then choose the Find button. Now the Allocation Inquiry screen displays all of my current allocation records, including those that are already allocated. Next, we locate the original credit memo, which has the reference number of 2-000. If I double-click on the credit memo line, SapphireOne simply opens and displays the transaction details, but I can't modify the allocation of this credit from within this screen. To locate the actual allocation details for my credit memo, I need to access some additional functionality within SapphireOne. Whenever we are in any of the inquiry screens within SapphireOne, we have access to a list of additional tools. For instance, when I open the Transaction Inquiry screen, I can go to the Tools button here on my toolbar and select the drop-down arrow to access a menu of additional functions. The Tools menu is divided into 3 sections. The top 2 sections display tools that are unique to the particular inquiry screen you are in, and the first tool on the list can be activated by clicking directly on the Tools button rather than using the arrow to display the entire menu. The third section of this menu displays tools that are standard across all inquiry screens. If you want to restrict a user's access to a particular tool, you can, and the deactivated tool will appear as grayed out on the Tools menu. Now I'll close out the Transaction Inquiry screen and reopen the Allocations Inquiry screen. When I select the Tools drop-down menu this time, you can see that I lose the functions that don't apply and gain others that are relevant to allocation inquiries. The first tool in this menu is Allocation. This means that the Allocation tool will be activated if I click directly on the Tools button itself. So to retrieve the allocation details for my credit memo, first I need to use the Find screen to change the current selection from Standard to All Records, as we did previously. I then locate my original credit memo, but this time, instead of double-clicking with my mouse, I will click on my credit memo line just once to highlight it. Now I need to activate the Allocation tool. This is the first tool on the list, so I can either select it from the Tools drop-down menu or simply click on the Tools button itself, and SapphireOne now presents me with the allocation details for my credit memo. If I look at the position area of my allocation screen, I can see that my credit memo has been allocated in its entirety as there is no remainder left to apply. I can see in the allocation lines area that the full amount has been applied to the original client invoice. The first step is to unallocate my credit memo, and to do this, I simply click once on the client invoice line. My remainder to be allocated is now the total amount of the credit memo. Next, I need to allocate part of the credit memo to my client journal to offset the overpayment. To do this, I click once on my new client journal in the allocation lines area, which leaves me with a remainder for the correct amount of the refund. I now allocate this back to the original invoice by clicking again on the invoice allocation line. My total allocated is displaying the full amount of my credit memo, so I'll select the green tick and SapphireOne accepts and closes the allocation screen. Now when I go to the Transaction Inquiry screen and open the original invoice, the Allocations tab in the Management Review area shows that the correct amount for the refund is being applied. That completes the client journal data entry and allocation. There is, however, another method of achieving the same result. If you need to create a journal that duplicates a previously posted transaction, such as when reversing an entry in its entirety, SapphireOne has provided us with a very handy tool. To demonstrate this, I need to open my Transaction Inquiry screen, so I'll go to the Receivables menu and select Transaction Inquiry. To make this easier to see, I'll reduce my Transaction Inquiry list so as it only displays the 2 transactions that we will be looking at. To do this, I select the first transaction and then, whilst holding down the Shift key, I select the second transaction with my mouse. Next, go to the Options drop-down menu and select the Show Subset option. As with all the menu items in SapphireOne, there is a shortcut, and for this option, it's Command G on a Mac or Control G on a PC. When I select it, SapphireOne reduces my transaction list to display only those items I highlighted. If I want to view all my transactions, I go to the Options menu again, but this time I'll select Show All, or use the shortcut Command-H on a Mac or Control-H on a PC. I'll quickly reduce my list again by selecting the items and using the shortcut Command or Control-G. Now here is my invoice and here is my credit. You can see both transactions have been posted because the status is yes. And when I use the Modify button to open one, I can't change anything. When I look at the Allocations tab of my invoice, I can see that 100% of the credit has been applied to it. I want to reverse the credit, but rather than creating a client journal and then reallocating the credit to it, as I did previously, this time I will use the Reverse Transaction tool, which is unique to transaction inquiries, and let SapphireOne do the work for me. To do this, I'll close this window and select the Client Credit line in the Transaction Inquiry screen. Next, I'll go to my toolbar and select the Tools drop-down menu by clicking on the arrow to the side of the Tools button. SapphireOne now presents me with a list of tools, the first two sections being unique to transaction inquiries. I'll scroll to the fourth item on the menu, which is Reverse Transaction. When I select it, SapphireOne displays a message that prompts me to confirm if I would like to proceed with the reversal. I do, so I'll select Yes. SapphireOne then requests the transaction date for the reversal. I'm happy with today's date, so I'll leave it as is and select OK. I now have three transactions: the original invoice, the credit, and the journal. When I open the journal that was created by SapphireOne and select the Allocations tab, I can see that the credit has been applied in full. And now when I open the original invoice and select the Allocations tab, I can see that the credit has been removed. The Reverse Transaction tool simplifies the process greatly, but remember, this tool can only be used when you are reversing a transaction in its entirety. So that's it for our movie, how to enter and allocate a client journal. I hope this was helpful and thank you for watching.